Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
My God, it's full of stars.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm one of your regular hosts, Scott Weatherly, and as usual, I'm joined by my time-travelling partner, Julian. How are you doing? You okay?
I'm doing all right. I expected to come back to this time and find a utopia in which both of our respective countries were governed by intelligent governments that were progressive and interested in uniting all peoples, and I'm very disappointed.
Yeah, I will say I'm a little disappointed as well. Not just in that, but possibly in the fact that I don't think I quite understood Primer.
Okay, well, I'm here to help.
Yeah. So yes, that's what we're talking about today. 2004's Primer, an independent film made incredibly low budget. I saw a couple of quotes, but whatever they were, it was made for the sort of the in the thousands rather than the millions. This thing's got an incredibly low budget, independent, made by Shane Carruth, who wrote it, directs it, stars in it, alongside David Sullivan. I think really they're the two people to focus on in this story. As Aaron and Abe, two sort of technical entrepreneurs, I think that's the way to describe them, working to find the next thing that will sort of go to market and can make them money. They, along with several other sort of these scientific entrepreneurs, come up with an idea to try and do something with weightlessness. I think that's what it is. But in doing so, create a time loop situation within the machine, which allows them to travel back to when the machine was turned on. We will try and get into the science because the film does. Never before have I had to sort of go into the dictionary definitions for certain words whilst watching a film. But this...
Yeah, I don't have that experience at all. I mean, I think that I think that none of that's really important. What's really important, really, in the first like third of the movie, in which we're kind of following Abe and Aaron, the two main characters, and their friends as their sort of like garage engineers, right? And it's gotten a lot of praise for really depicting that kind of culture in a very realistic way. And they're kind of like initially taking turns to see whose project they spend some time on. But yes, there's a lot of dialogue that you don't really necessarily have to get it. The main thing that you have to get is that time travel in this story, and this is a very scientifically responsible version of time travel. You set up a box and you can travel back in time to when you set up that box, but you can't just magically Back to the Future style, basically teleport yourself to a different time and place. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, yeah. They give it an explanation. I think that's the thing. As you sort of say, the first sort of third of this film sort of sets them up and sort of sets up the situation in which the sort of the science is being built, and there's an awful lot of. I don't want to call it techno babble because it is actual. From what I understand, it's actually very technical, accurate technical stuff, and because it felt very accurate, and that was my understanding. I felt it was going to be important to the plot. And that's why I was sort of like, I was literally sort of jotting things down and go, okay, well, they're talking about this now. Okay, well, there's going to be something about that. And I'm checking sort of some of these words and then they never come up. It never pays off. It's not really important. And I was like, oh, it sort of, I felt sort of like I should have, I felt like I wish it had done because I felt I put work into the first third of this film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely this is a movie that benefits from multiple viewings.
Mm,
I think the first time that I watched it, I don't even know how I found it. I was thinking in preparing for this podcast, I don't even know how I found this. I can't imagine how I did, but I think as soon as I finished it, it took me a little while, but I was so in love with it that I just instantly watched it all again.
mm.
um and it was like one of those moments where you've made like a real discovery of something that you really love and that is going to affect you, and you want to dive right back into it. I trust you had a different experience.
uh, it's one of those. I think I liked the concept, and one of the things I think that you and I have sort of spoken about on previous podcasts is this. The admiration really for smaller stories. Because not sometimes events don't impact the whole world. So the fact that these two guys create what is tantamount to a time machine, um, and then try to put the rules in place and then use it in small ways and
Hmm.
stuff. I really like that because it sort of feels real.
Hmm.
It felt legit. So they put the rules in place, like they can only go back to a certain point. So when the first guy does it, when Abe first does it, he says, "Well, I'm going to go back 6 hours." So for those 6 hours, actually, the current me can't interact with anybody. So I've got to almost disengage myself from the world for that period, and then I'll go into the box and I'll see what happens. And so that sort of things like that, I'm like, that's a really good idea. Like they're not going to try and tell you this, this Back to the Future 2 sort of thing where you got two versions of the same people creeping around a disco or anything like that. They're actually thinking it through, and because it sort of felt like I was really impressed with the notion and the ideas that went into it. But
Well,
narratively, it just felt like it
uh,
lacked drama or impact.
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know. I mean, I think that the second half, what's funny is every time I watch this movie, I remember all these things that happen. And I remember
Mm.
like there's a fight at the party. There's all this stuff that goes on. And okay, well, we're gonna spoil the plot. One of the things that I love
Yeah.
most, and that is damn brilliant, is you realize at a certain point in the film that almost everything you have watched was already altered by somebody
Yes.
having gone back in time. And there's a kind of like cut to black early on. There are several of these, but there are many points in which what you are watching you have never seen like the first iteration of. Um, you've only seen a timeline that was already altered. Um,
I
and
didn't
I mean
get that.
that's a
So,
brilliant twist. I mean that's
oh yeah,
like
I didn't get that. The moment I realised that was the moment. I mean, I'm going to spoil it. So the film
yeah.
ends with there's a party that they're going to attend to. Their friend Rachel's having a party, and there's an argument with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend goes out to his car drunkenly and gets his shotgun. And the story is relayed by two of their friends during the start of the film, and they say, "Oh, what happened?" Well, nothing really, because the gun was empty. And that it's sort of left at that. And I was like, oh, okay, that's the story. And then at the end of the film, when it all sort of pans out, and you see that, like I say, the moment that guy then walks into the party at the end, because that's the sort of the point it reaches round to again, is I was like, oh, actually, like I say, I've never seen anything that hasn't, as you say, hasn't been altered before, or hasn't been unaltered, I should say. Um, yeah, because even though I was really working this film, like, that didn't click with me until the very end. So I'll give them credit for that. That was really clever.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. It kind of I don't know. I mean, I have a giant timeline that I constructed, probably like that second viewing or something. I started
Mm.
a project of kind of putting everything together, and basically at 1930. So less than 20 minutes into the movie, as far as they haven't perfected this time machine. And then you get this very strange shot as Aaron kind of walks to the edge of the roof and looks down and goes down and has this conversation. And Abe's already got he's already got what you later find out are recordings of a past iteration of this conversation. And he's already got this headphone in. So he's already got these recordings of the conversation. And you don't find out until later. I mean, basically at this point, each of them has screwed each other over,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
but there was what's fascinating there is there was some previous iteration, the previous iteration of that conversation in which there's no headphone in. There is a kind of like, timeline 1.0 in which that happened. There was no headphone in and things played out. And one of the things that ends up haunting Aaron is sort of how was that timeline going to play out if I hadn't gone back in time? If I hadn't used the machine, what happened the first time at that party with the shotgun? There's no way to reconstruct that. We don't know.
No, and this becomes that sort of, because at one point in the film, that they're at a petrol station to sort of like, and that's the one thing I like about this. One of the things I do like about this film is, with it being an indie film, a lot of the conversations that they do feel. I mean, the acting's not always fantastic, but it feels natural. This is just two friends talking. So there's like really important conversations, and if this was a Hollywood film, it'd be set up in a really dramatic way. Sort of lit in a specific way, and it'd be in an office or a laboratory or whatever. But then there's quite important exchanges between them that just sort of happen, in the kitchen, or like say this one. But one of them's at a petrol station. They fill up the car, and he sort of says, "Well, I don't know about paradoxes. I'm not really that bothered. It doesn't, it doesn't interest me. We've just got to do this." And it's sort of a decision point. It feels to me, at least, where they're like, we can't worry about that. We've just got to keep going ahead with this thing. And it feels that's sort of like how it would be, wouldn't it? It's sort of like, okay, well, this conversation's reached a peak at this point, and then that's the decision we're going to make. And there's little bits like that which I actually really like in the film. And I was sort of focusing on those, and so I like the relationship between these two guys. And so when you do find out that it's starting to get a bit rocky, it's it feels natural.
Yeah, and I think that of the things that this. I mean, I love this movie so much. Of the things that it does really well, one is this kind of naturalistic dialogue. Despite, I mean, yeah, there are lines where you think, the inflection is a little off. Maybe this isn't the best delivered line, but it has that kind of like awkward, real dialogue where there are lines that just aren't important, that are about, maybe we could do it this way. And yeah, they're not going to do it this way. It's not important. This is the kind of back and forth that you would have in a lab. And there are lines like that in the car. And then there are lines like that wind up being really important later. And you don't really know which is which the first time through. But I really love that kind of naturalism. I love that it, as you say, like it is grounded in their relationship and this way in which having this device changes people. Yes, you started in a garage, but, you look at all of these startups and, the original founders always end up fighting, right?
Yeah.
This is something that, I mean, by the end, like, they're drugging their wives, like there's a lot, there's a copy of a guy in an attic, I mean, there's a lot of just subterfuge that's going to go on once you have this power and you start thinking of the implications. And along that line, I love that, as you said, it's a small story, but it thinks through these implications. I am a sucker for time travel stories. I love time travel stories, but 90% of them are just groan worthy. And they're groan worthy to me because their version of time travel is so damn stupid. Like for example, there are many Star Trek episodes that do this. Not to pick on Star Trek, but where it's like, okay, we're altering time, and Doctor Who does the same thing. We're altering time and bouncing through time, and traveling back in time and altering it, and then at the end you find out like, oh, that character was the future self of somebody who was like helping them out. Okay, that was written by a brain dead person, because that if you can alter time, you live in a universe in which you can alter time. You cannot have a loop that is, in other words, the causality has been broken because the first time through, that person was already there from the future. Well, time works one way or it works the other. You cannot have both in the same story. Primer does a fantastic job of just, setting these realistic rules for how this works. And this is, it's speculative physics, but it's responsible speculative physics. That you can only travel back, within this device. Having problems with the device, it's not pleasant to be in this device. They kind of start bleeding. There are these side effects. And there are things that they don't know. And then kind of, setting these responsible rules. It's hard science fiction. And then just teasing through what are the implications? What would happen to people who had this?
Well, yeah, because I think I like that you mentioned about the side effects. Like, it starts with, and again, they're sort of teased but never explored. It's almost like, again, that natural thing, and that's why it feels so sort of real, is the denial of it. Like, they don't actually want to talk about it. So at one point, their ears bleed slightly when they've been through it, and that thing's like a physical thing. But also the other thing is their handwriting, like, they struggle to write. And he says, like, at one point, he says, like, they've clearly been writing, and it actually shows you the page, and he's struggling to write, but it's never addressed. And then later, literally within a couple of minutes, he sort of says, "And how's your writing?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm struggling." He says, "I can see the letters, and I know what I've got to do, but I can't seem to make my hands do it." And I'm thinking, like, that's a pretty big side effect. That's a pretty big issue, and you're just going to sidestep it. And it just feels incredibly human to be a bit like, yeah, that sounds really bad, but so I don't want to talk about that because it feels bad. So we're going to carry on. And so I do feel that these are human characters. I do feel for them, and I do sort of quite like that. And I like the fact, like I say, it's got specific rules and it sticks to them. And I do quite like that. So it does have this thing of, like, you say, they're not going to go back into the Wild West. They're not going to go, or like a dinosaur's not going to come tearing out the machine at any point or anything like that. It's not, like you say, blockbuster sci-fi. It feels like it has a sort of like these set rules and they stick to them. I think for me, like you say, it's one of those where I try to like this film, and I see there's a lot to like, but there's also this whole thing around the whole film that I think it feels intentionally difficult as well. Like, they've already given you like they've given you an interesting concept, and they've tried to explain it. First, they're trying to explain it with technical science, and they give you this interesting concept that they try and explain, in a non. And I'm coming at it as a layperson. I'm coming at it as an idiot, so I'm quite comfortable to accept that I'm not coming this as to fully understand it.
But neither of us have engineering degrees, Scott. I mean,
yeah. But then narratively, like, it jumps about a bit, and I'm like, oh, okay, so now, like you say, it requires a rewatch, which again I'm quite comfortable with, but it's almost like it almost does it on purpose, which I sort of find frustrating when I'm like, there would have been easier and possibly more satisfying ways for me for this story to have been told.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with that. I mean, I think obviously I'm quite taken with this film, and I was the first time through. But having said that, I mean, I always feel as if it needs to be half an hour longer than it is. Um,
Yes.
it's about an hour, 17 minutes or something.
Mm.
And every time I watch it, I'm amazed by how really they don't invent the time machine until 20 minutes in. You don't really get rolling with them using the time. I mean, it's very meticulous. They show
Mm.
you them using the time. I mean, so that's all good, but you don't really get to that until you're sort of halfway through the movie. um
Mm.
and at that point, all this stuff that I remember, like the fight, like there are these strange noises in the attic. Well, you've only seen an iteration where there were those strange noises. So I
Mm.
mean, you've missed whole iterations of the timeline. We keep jumping forward to further effects, and of the timeline having been altered between scenes, and all of that I love. But there's just so much in that last sort of half hour, 40 minutes that I feel as if it should be longer. And I also feel for you that there's no need to make everything quite this obtuse. In other
Yeah.
words, like, it's nice that there are some dialogue lines that don't make sense at the time, but are important later. But at the end of the movie, I don't need the side effects to be explained, but there are lots of things that you could have smoothed over and just made a little easier for your audience, because they're already having to grasp this version of time travel and a narrative in which you have to understand, like, oh, these like three iterations happened between these two scenes, and
Yeah.
I've got to like figure out what happened there. And it makes sense, but it does involve a little bit of work.
It's true, and I think I will benefit from going back, and I think I will go back and watch this to really go, and invest in it, to try and get more out of it. But I think one of those things is it's sort of to reference a film we are going to cover soon. Inception is one of those things again about what's the dream world that you're in, and there's a whole thing around the spinning top, and there's some other sort of rules that say, okay, if this is happening, you're in a dream, and if it's not happening, you're not, and that sort of thing. And with this, it's sort of like this feels like if they'd have, I'm sure they wanted to. I'm not saying if they were smart enough, because they're clearly very bright people, but they could have chosen, like you say, it could be that there's something in it that says, oh yeah, there's something either in the background or something small that just says, if you were to go back and watch it, you can see that this appears or disappears, or when this is about, you're in this timeline and that sort of thing. And do you know what I mean? Like it just a small indication, because, and I get that that's sort of the point though, that they're not trying to impact, they're trying not to impact it. But just something like you say, because otherwise, you
Well,
you
see,
sort of need that to this like you say, this film requires a second viewing in order to
yeah.
understand the first.
Well, I mean, we'll be talking about Inception next week. Inception is one of
Mm.
my favorite movies. I mean, I love it. But Chris Nolan is brilliant at doing exactly what you sort of wanted here, which was, which is like, okay, have a high concept, um, don't dumb it down, but at the same time, kind of spoon feed it to people and give them a
Mm.
little bit of sugar to aid the digestion,
Yeah.
and he's very good at finding that kind of middle ground. Made for $7,000 or whatever. I mean, this movie was not able to do that. I think it would have benefited from reshoots. I think it would have benefited from more sort of padding out these relationships. I mean, there are times where you're watching maybe like 4 minutes, and at the beginning of those 4 minutes and at the end, if you really go back and look at it, there was a change to the timeline at the beginning of that 4 minute segment and at the end. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
pretty aggressive. But I like that there's no indication that time has been altered, and I think that for me, that plays into the kind of like paranoid feeling that you have in this film. The music is very minimal, but it also is a little paranoid, and the way the two friends start going at each other, there's stuff that they don't know. You can't trust I mean, one of the things that I love about this film so much is that it's smart. That like there are things like the idea of, yeah, okay, before I showed you all of this, I started a failsafe machine.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I showed you a storage unit. At that point, I had already set up another storage unit and turned on the device so that if everything went wrong, I could go back to this earlier point. Now, that's very smart. But there are so many things like this that are just, yeah, they're twists, but they're just super intelligent twists that usually, in a mainstream movie wouldn't even get introduced until the sequel or something.
Yeah, and I agree, and that's a sort of or you'd have had like the murder mystery ending, a sort of thing where the ending would be literally sort of someone saying, taking you back to that moment, and like you say, you'd like to be spoon fed it, and you'd be walked through and shown where everything changed and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of. I can imagine that would be the Hollywood answer to this. Because I mean, one of the things from this film that I find most interesting is one of the things that popped into my head when I watched it was almost like not the franchise but the first film is to think this is almost like the opposite. It's like an anti-Terminator in that sort of we've sort of talked about Terminator in the past between ourselves, and we've that the idea that first film is a fixed loop, that you can't get away from the fact that Skynet is created and John Connor is born and that future conflict happens because a Terminator was sent back as long as was Kyle Reese, which started that time loop, and so round and round it goes. And that's sort of the idea of determinism and fate and all that sort of stuff. Right. But in this, so you can't change that no matter what happens. That's that. When forget the rest of the franchise, the point of that first film is you can't change that. That's will always happen, and it always has happened. So there is no alternative timeline where somebody else was John Connor's father. Like there is no other timeline. That is the timeline as it stands. And then with this, like I said, they keep going back and they make alterations. And the fact okay, we've sort of talked about spoilers, right? But the end of this film is you end up with two versions of both people in one timeline. Mm-hmm. Because they've gone back and they've actually changed the timeline, so they don't create the time. Now, I may have misunderstood this, but they go back to stop, so they don't create the time machine. Is that right?
I don't think that's right. No, I don't think that's right. So, yeah.
Because there's a bit where they're at the airport at the end of the film.
Right. Yeah.
And they've done everything they're going to do. And he's saying, he's going to, let's go off into the world.
Oh, right. Yeah.
We can take our passports, or we can take their passports. I love the fact they refer to them, the alternative versions of them, as them. We can take their passports. We know they're not using them, and we can just go. And, we've got this money, we're sorted. And he's like, no, I can't. I've got to stay.
Yeah, so they scuttle the original guy's project. I mean, the original guys have a working time machine, but it's really easy to mess with it and make it seem like this isn't in fact working, where in fact you've got a double out there who only exists because it does work.
Yeah, right, and that's so it's interesting because he does actually say, he says, "Oh yeah, I went in," and he literally said, I'm sure he says, "I pulled a wire out." It's almost like every time they try and say, "Oh, like, yeah, I screwed with it a little bit." And so that ends sort of because there's two parts to the ending. I was trying to sort of understand. Was this notion because they're saying we could just go off now because we're now literally going to always be stuck in this timeline. We have changed that sort of the way things go. So that was what was interesting to me, was that sort of thing, and then the guy's going to have to stick around. So was that your understanding that they're actually going to, or will it? Could there still be a time machine invented, or successfully turned on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the finale, the ending, is sort of doing as you say. Like, I mean, they've scuttled the original. In theory, they could invent another, but the point is that the two friends have evolved away from each other, right? Mm-hmm. Aaron loves these people and needs to stay, and Abe goes off to uh, basically at the very end, you see him working with a French company to make a wildly upscaled version of this machine.
So that was going to be my question, because that's what I thought that was. That because he's
Oh,
sort
yeah.
of like, he's like, oh yeah, he says something like little pieces everywhere. So he's obviously going to make a much bigger version of it.
Well, he says like, okay, so every 5 meters. So like
Yes.
those sort of like sort of plastic PVC pipe tubing that you kind of see in the box, they're building a giant PVC pipe.
Yeah.
It's like that's every 5 meters now. So it's like a warehouse sized, sort of aircraft hangar sized version that is being built, and it sort of plays into the whole like original commercial purpose. That at the beginning they're very concerned about money. The point is to make a project that's going to be um, fiscally logical for them. They're not really science for the sake of science guys. This is a startup, and by the end, yeah, that's followed through. And the point is, yeah, we did this amazing thing, and we can sell this. We can do great things with this. But only one of them wants to do it.
Yeah, and one of them's willing to do that. But that was the question. Because the thing that I found interesting in this was this idea of making it marketable, and I mean they find a way of making money off it, and they talk about doing the stock market, and they talk about betting on sports, and they can make money all this other way, which is all interesting. And then, but the thing I find interesting is that for that ending is. And I suppose it comes down to sort of logistics, but like one of them's going to stay behind and sort of like watch their family or whatever, and make sure that it doesn't get invented or that sort of thing. So that seems almost like a full-time job. So it's that thing of like as a double, like you've created it's almost the physics of that of being okay. You are the same, literally the same person in that same time slip or that timeline. And that sort of thing is never really addressed. It's never sort of like, okay, there's two of us in this time slot, and then the other guy's gone off and he's going to invent it with a French company on a large scale.
Mm-hmm.
And how's he? It's like, okay, so he is, Aaron or Abel, whichever one it is. He's still going to have to get credit and paid for all that. The point is to get paid. So, I'm assuming he has to have taken on a different identity and.
Sure. Well, he might be able to retain some kind of control, right? I mean, he might not have just sold it to this French company. But, again, one of the things that I love about this is not just the financial aspect, but also the sense of logic about how time works. I mean, personally, I think that the sort of closed loop, you can't alter time thing in the original Terminator is the most responsible. There's some scientific evidence that is in fact the universe we live in. You cannot cause a time paradox if you tried. You cannot alter time if you tried. The universe will not permit this. And I would say the only caveat I would say about Terminator is if that's the case, why does Skynet not know that? Like the entire point is to go back in time and alter it. And we're in a universe in which you can't. Okay, that's fine. But that's a minor quibble. I like that version of time travel. On the other hand, you have any version in which you can alter time. And incidentally, I'm always frustrated by even the Back to the Future version where I think, okay, so you went back in time, you realize you have a teleporter now too, because the Earth was not in the same place back then. So your time machine is also a teleporter, yet you don't seem to have teleportation technology. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I think way too much, but any universe in which you can alter time is very quickly going to go crazy. Mm-hmm. And so, in other words, like, how you have like versions of time travel in which like Cable comes from the future and he comes to the present, and then the future is erased, but Cable's still in the present, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, so how does your universe work? When time is altered, does that mean that Cable no longer came back to the present, in which case, if he was part of time being altered, you have just literally destroyed the space-time continuum. Because if he didn't come back, now he never came back. Now the first timeline occurs and he goes back. Having come back, he erases himself. Then the first iteration occurs and the universe is forever flipping between these two states. Or you have a scenario in which Cable stays in the present, and now you have this weird kind of situation in which I can just create doubles of myself. There is no reason to think that, like, the space-time continuum starts falling apart because two versions of Julian or two versions of Scott see each other. There's no, I mean, that seems some kind of weird metaphysics to me. That's like, you know, they have one soul split between two people. Okay, shut up, man. But so, you know, in a universe in which you can alter time, you are always going to have multiple copies of people. You're going to have stuff go crazy really fast. And I love that in this really low budget, you know, 90-minute movie, it gets to that point by the end where there's that whole thing with like Mr. Granger, where they see Mr. Granger and they're like, okay, he was clean shaven earlier. Now he's got a full beard, right? This is near the end. They go to the coffins, the time machines, and they're like, okay, which one of us in a previous timeline would have helped Mr. Granger and put him in one of these? And we cannot turn these off because somebody's inside them and they're experiencing time in reverse. And what happens if we turn this off? So, you know, again, you're kind of like seeing this later version of, so, I mean, stuff has really gone crazy by the end. And that whole using of the failsafe, like you said, is an attempt to just kind of like undo all of this craziness. Obviously, there are like dozens of iterations that we've never seen. They don't even understand like who did the Mr. Granger stuff. Let's start over and not have all of these problems.
And I do like that. They do sort of try to resolve that. But I also like I say that the Mr. Granger one's really interesting because they're just driving past, aren't they? And they're like, he's got a beard. Like he was trying to keep clean shaven because he was going to an event or something. So I do like those sort of, because the other thing as well, he takes his mobile phone. We're back. Trying to be right now. He either takes the mobile phone back or they discuss taking the mobile phone back. And they're sort of trying to say, like, how does it work? So if there's two phones that have got the same, you know, same number and the same sort of, basically, it is literally the same phone. Like, okay, will they ring at the same time? Does this create some sort of technical issue? Or which will one ring first? And they're trying to sort of figure out how a network works in order for this to understand. And it's, so yeah, you can see that sort of like the slightest slip could, like you say, make things go crazy. And that's where they sort of, like you say, originally, like that first time he does it perfect, isn't he? Sort of, he disengages from the world for 6 hours, knowing that's how long he's going to go back, and sort of doesn't interact with anybody. Well, I mean, doesn't interact with anybody, doesn't do anything, just sits in a hotel room, and then he goes into it and comes out 6 hours earlier, and then he can do whatever he needs to do. And that sort of seems like the only scenario where it's like, oh yeah, that small jump has had minimal impact from his point of view. But then, if he, you know, you could then go back and say, okay, well, I sat in a room and didn't do anything for 6 hours, because that means that the other me can then go and do all my normal stuff and that sort of thing. But as you say, but if there's multiple versions coming back and doing that, as they say at one point, because he comes out, the other version went and took his car, so you know, like he had to then get a taxi somewhere. Sort of like trying to keep a track of all this that's going on. And as you said, sort of like almost as I like the fact you called it a project to put the timeline together for this.
Yes,
because it really is. Because there are still moments in this, like where I'm trying to pinpoint what's going on. For example, there's a bit where they're sat outside the storage center. They've gone to, but you know, they're watching it, and they're sat in a truck with binoculars, watching themselves going in. And I'm like, all right. So, and he's sort of going, okay, so which one's which? And sort of, like you say, this film does not allow you to blink at times. And like, you know, you've got to almost know. Weirdly, like in time travel, you've got to know what to look out for in order to know what to look for.
Right.
So that's why I think the second viewing is obviously more important, because you know what you are trying to find. And
Yeah,
whilst I
and then
appreciate that, I
go ahead.
appreciate to some extent in films where I'm like, okay, I love going back and finding Easter eggs or getting more from a film to appreciate it more. But to actually just understand it, I don't know, it feels a bit like if I was to see this in the cinema and then was like, oh, okay, well, I've actually got to see it again to try and appreciate everything in the first two bits, it feels a little unsatisfying. I just keep coming back to that, really.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, I mean, okay, so I would say different people feel satisfied by different things, right?
Mm.
Um, you know, I don't know. I mean, I struggled for a long time with going back to Chris Nolan, some of his more sort of puzzle box like movies. Um, and I'm a huge Chris Nolan fan, but and I wrote a book about Batman Begins.
Mm.
But even writing that book and after that book, I found myself kind of struggling with the fact that I never felt, in all of the many times I had seen that film to write that book, I had never felt that much of an emotional connection with the plot. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought, oh, this is because I knew I was writing a book and I'm taking copious notes and I'm overly intellectual to begin with. And, I'm the guy who sits there picking stuff apart the first time through, which annoys everyone else. But, so for me, I would say I find it satisfying by the end, but it's satisfying because I'm thinking of all these things and they're interesting and smartly done enough that I want to figure them out.
Mm.
So that's satisfying for me, for my personality. And I don't know, like, I like the characters, I like what they've done with them, but I'm not especially emotionally invested in them. I do feel a
Mm.
little something, but I'm not all that emotionally invested, and that's fine with me. It's a different kind of satisfying. Well, that's just me, and I recognize that I may be an odd duck here. The
No,
second
no,
thing
no. 'Cause I think 'cause
yeah,
it does it's that's because I think that's what it's going for. That's I think because again one of the things I read was Shane Carruth when he was trying to
hmm
cast this, he cast himself as Aaron because, and he also used sort of amateur actors and stuff as well because he was bringing in other actors. He says they kept trying to insert drama into things, and he was like, no, it's not about that. He was to end up putting himself in it so he could get the message across.
hmm
Um, so I feel that like although this centers around a friendship, that's sort of like the core of the film to the most part. It also, but it isn't the point, if you know what I mean.
right, yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's not grounded in character the way we sort of expect stuff to be grounded in character.
hmm.
I personally, I don't care about character. And I know that I'm insane, but I mean, to me, to my weird brain, I think structurally, and to my real weird brain, characters are an epiphenomenon of the plot. And so I watch a movie and I'm like, oh, here's the scene in which character B gets angry and changes, makes a decision to behave differently, sending them on a different trajectory for the rest of the plot. Okay, I see what that function, I see what the scene is about. It's about that function. This character is a pawn on the chessboard. That's not to say I don't have any emotional reaction. I do. I do care about characters, but they are kind of chess pieces to be moved around.
Mm.
So, I mean, there are other people. I have, some of my best friends are people who, when I talk to about movies, they say, yeah, I don't know about any of that. They don't know about anything that I'm talking about. They're like, I don't know if this is a good movie or not. All I know is like, I love this character. I love their journey. And I'm just like, yeah, I understand that. But, we're totally alien to each other. Um, I mean, there are things that people watch that they just say, I love that character. Yeah, and that person is probably not going to love this movie.
No, I understand that, and I think that's one of the things as well is that you say this film was done as a sort of I feel that the narrative structure is intentional. And I say yes, I find it in a little frustrating. And I say so is the choice of the scientific terminology, and obviously the use of specific shots and all this other stuff that's sort of throughout the film is all intentional. So again, it's that thing again. This feels like it was done as it's independent as well, and which gives the director and obviously the creator Shane Carruth all that the ability to do that. And so this is his vision. And as you say, this isn't sort of like a melodrama. It's not about character development and that sort. They have an arc as they do, but this is most definitely a technical exploration. It's almost like a thesis, isn't it? It's sort of like, okay, this is what happens, and here's how it's most likely to happen, and would it be used responsibly? Maybe it's that thing of like I'm just so used to and bred on, as you say, sort of like the 3-act structure, or that typical Hollywood narrative. And I do like characters. I do sometimes need a character to cling to. That that's some sort of why I struggle with this film, but not with the concept. Because again, I think the disappointment I had was I loved the concept and I loved the end result, but felt the journey was like
Not
an
fun.
obstacle course. Yeah, it was almost like it was like an obstacle course when I thought it was going to be a running race.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Do you know what I mean?
yeah, I totally understand, and that's totally fair. I think that when I think of what I want out of a movie, right? Some movies are like a roller coaster ride. I mean, you're just along for the ride, and it is amazing. This movie is more like a puzzle box, and it engages your brain, and your brain is fascinated and curious, but cannot take in the whole 3-dimensional puzzle at once. Which makes sense because you're never going to know what happened in a previous iteration. I think that. Go ahead.
I'll tell you what I'm thinking, because if I think back to Solaris, and Solaris was an interesting beat in itself, and following Russian translations for 3 hours is a challenge in itself. But I found I enjoyed that film because of its introspection and some of the questions it raised. But it's an odd film. It's got some really interesting bits and pieces. But because of the pace of that film, and you are given as a viewer moments of reflection. Like that film's going to give you something really bizarre and really weird, like a concept or an idea or something, and then it's going to be like, okay, let's sit back and then just enjoy some weirdness or let's take a breath for a few minutes, and we're going to get through the next scene, or there's going to be something else, and it gives your brain a chance to catch up. And that's what I think this film, as you say, would benefit from 15-20 minutes more, where it could introduce things and then be like, now let's take a step back, just give you a moment to digest that, and then we're back onto it again.
I agree completely.
Just that room to breathe would probably make this. If you give the food analogy, this film is sort of trying to eat a dinner on a conveyor belt. It's sort of like, and here's the next bit, and here's the next bit, and here's the next bit. I think of like I think of I Love Lucy. The thing with it, she's trying to do the pies as they keep coming past.
Right.
And for me, it's like, okay, well, my brain it needs that moment of introspection to process it. And by the time I've got that, I'm like, oh crap, I'm 3 pies down and I'm running out of space.
Right.
And yeah, so I think that you're right. It does need multiple views, and I think I would benefit from multiple views, and I might even like it more. Two,
Yeah.
3, 4 viewings down the line. Um, um,
Well,
but I sometimes feel that should I have to do that?
right.
But then maybe,
Well,
but then when I think of other media, I would do it with a book. I would probably do it with a comic as well. So, mm,
well, I mean, and in the movie's defense, I mean, it's 70 minutes, right? I mean,
yeah. Oh yeah, it's easy to do.
and it's a very much more enjoyable for me. I mean, I can't even compare this to like a 3 hour long, blockbuster where I think, yeah, you should have cut an hour and a half and it still would not have been that enjoyable for me. Here's 70 minutes where it's a hard 70 minutes because you're engaging with it. You have to think about it. It's not just like, you know, penguins with superpowers or something, which look, I like, but I think the other thing is, that you sort of hit on is about ambiguity. And I think that there are different kinds of ambiguity. And I think that this movie would be better if it had an extra 30 minutes to sort of space things out, um, not necessarily spoon feed the audience a little, but kind of like make certain things clearer. If it were Chris Nolan, right, you'd get more kind of like flashbacks to like, here's what happened the first time through, you do get one flashback early on, but you don't get the like twist, like, okay, here's what you didn't see kind of ending. But, there are different kinds of ambiguity, right? There are a lot of the like techno jargon at the beginning to me is really about establishing this culture and that realism of the sort of garage engineer culture. And,
Mm,
you don't have to get all of the specifics of how the machine works. It's all speculative physics anyway. You just have to get how the basic end result, right? But
mm,
it's all there to kind of create this space, this culture. Later on, there are things like, who sent Mr. Granger, what's going on with Mr. Granger, that are not going to be resolved. And
mm,
they are perhaps irresolvable because there have been multiple iterations that you have not seen. And
mm,
even the characters themselves can't figure out, okay, what happened in those iterations. One of them did something. One of us decided for whatever reason, which we, from this point of view, cannot reconstruct. I mean, it's like the loss of information as something falls into a black hole, right? I mean, we
mm.
cannot reconstruct. We do not have access to this previous timeline. Um, so there is kind of ambiguity like that, which I find acceptable, and which you don't have to really know. And I think about like, Ezra Pound said that people would complain that when they read his poetry, they would say, I don't you've got Greek words in here. I don't know what any of this means, and he would say, pay attention to the sound of it. Everybody's got their own
Mm.
vocabulary, their own knowledge base, go with the flow, pay attention to the sound of it. And I think that sometimes that embrace of ambiguity is abused. I think in this film, it's justified by the narrative intelligence of the film. And you don't need to know what happened with Mr. Granger. I don't mind knowing if I could, but then there's other kinds of ambiguity in narrative, like, sort of like David Lynch-esque ambiguity, where it's like, why did a hamburger appear out of nowhere and start talking and explain it's a god from another dimension? Hey, just go with it, dude. Why do you have to know
Yeah.
that? Yeah, F you, right? Um,
Yes.
so anyway, I mean, I think, but I do think that ambiguity combined with the lack of sort of like the typical emotional like resonances of the plot make this a harder going film.
Yeah. I think the thing, like you say, is at 70 minutes, though, it's something you probably, and I will revisit, try and get more from. Um, and I think, for our listeners, if you haven't already, but you are going to go and try this, I think when you sit down to watch this film, put your phone down, close the door. Like, this film demands your attention. I think that's sort of the thing to take from this, and I think you will get something from it, especially if you're a sci-fi fan. Like, and as Julian, as you said, like, if you're a time travel fan and you want to sort of, there's those other scenarios that are sort of thrown out there in other films, whether they be Back to the Future or Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure or Terminator, all those different things. Like, this film, like you say, predominantly sticks to its rules, but like you say, it sort of asks bigger questions, I suppose, that it's not going to give you the answers to, but it's going to point to them and say, yeah, even when you apply this level of logic to it, there's still a whole bunch of stuff that, like, is unknown. Like, we cannot know or answer these questions, and that could be quite scary.
Yeah, I think that's all important caveats. I think that you can sort of figure it out. There are things that are unknowable. I mean, I should also say this is a very celebrated movie. And it came out at a time when there were a lot of blockbuster sci-fi movies that were really dreadful and terrible. And the fact that you could make a brilliant sci-fi movie with this kind of budget, it took 2 years in post. Well, that's what you do when you really want to do something with no budget. I know from experience. You sweat like this and you manage to create something. And I think its place in culture in that respect is kind of similar to Moon, where people were like, okay, this is amazing. It has basically one character. It's not about all of this great stuff, big, earth-shattering stuff, but it was a shock to the system in terms of showing people you could do amazing sci-fi with a smaller scope, or in this case, with a smaller budget.
Yeah, I think Moon is a film I think we hopefully we'll get to at some point, because that's a film I really like that film, and I think you're right though. I think I can see why this film was celebrated and won several awards against some of the dreck that was coming out at the time. And it is challenging. I think I think of it, like you said, about what you mentioned, sort of Christopher Nolan. I think of like Memento, and that's a film that, as you say, sort of like, that's not a film I watched just once. That's a film where I'm like, okay, when the first time I watched it, I was like, okay, I've got to go back and watch this now, because I've got all these thoughts and I've got to understand this in a much as much as possible. So I wonder, I was obviously taken by that film, and I went and watched it. I did go back and watch it again. So I think there's clearly a difference there. And I think for me, like you say, it's that investment in character that I think sort of strikes me more with, say, Memento and maybe some other films than this.
Yes. And that's good to have. I mean, I think it's something that Nolan has enough of that to balance out the smart stuff. And the end result is something that is usually very satisfying, at the same time that it's, it manages to be commercial and, I don't think as smart as this, but pretty smart, and satisfying for me. I mean, I love that kind of quintessentially Hollywood blend of sort of the art film and the commercial stuff. And, I mean, especially continental Europe is really good at, the French are really good at the art film. They're not so great at the commercial stuff. And America's really great at, commercial schlock. That's 90% of it is terrible. Probably, 90% of it makes me vomit, and I think 95% of it is terrible. But there are those happy sort of convergences where in the Venn diagram of, artsy and smart, and the other side is, I get it, I love this character. There's a convergence in the middle and Chris Nolan is perfectly in that harmonic for me.
Mm. Well, I think we will have to see, because obviously this is both being recorded and will be released in 2020, and he is Christopher Nolan is going back to do time travel in some way. I don't know if you've seen the trailer for Tenet.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll be interested to see how he handles it. I don't think that is going to have a scientific basis, but
well, it might. Inception. He brought in lots of science. That was the whole origin of that movie. But
it's true.
Even Inception, throws out the science when it needs to, or at least ignores it when it needs to, for the plot and for the character.
Yeah,
which this movie does not.
No, and that's it's a bold choice. It's a choice to be made, I suppose.
Well, if you like intellectual puzzle boxes, this is a fantastic movie for you. So I was thinking, I'm looking at my, I have a massive spreadsheet that I created for this, and cells in that sheet that are in yellow indicate things we have actually seen. And the first box is the first 19 and a half minutes. The second box, right, which is a sequence that's about a minute and 20 seconds long, which is, my description is, Abe 1.1 now meets with Aaron 2.1, who is using Aaron 2.0's recordings.
So is this on the bench? Is this when he comes out on the bench and he's got
right? And
yes,
that's the first time, right? He goes to the roof, and then you see him go down. That second box that's in yellow is, in my chart, iteration 2.1, and between those two yellow boxes is 30 boxes that I've constructed information for, reconstructed from what you've seen of all the stuff that happened between those two that you never saw between 19 and a half minutes in and 1931. If these sentences sound like, oh my God, that's amazing, which it would to me, this is the movie for you. If you hear that and you think, oh my God, I never want to see that, stay away.
Yeah. I'm really, I love the fact you got to a spreadsheet as well, because everyone loves a good spreadsheet. But I'm hoping you started with a wall and red thread, and you were sort of pinning bits to pieces. That's what I wanted to see.
Yeah, it's my I call it my serial killer wall, and I use it for a lot of things like that.
But yeah, that I tell you what, one of the things I watched this on, I rented it from Amazon Prime, and once I watched it, one of the things I was thinking about was I would love to see I'm hoping, I don't know if it's on Blu-ray, but I'm assuming a commentary on this would be really interesting to have, sort of the director and some of the actors or whatever, actually talk their way through it and just get some of that behind the scenes as well, because I find it would be a fascinating idea to sort of say, he clearly, I'm assuming, to at least 80-90%, he has got that timeline and all those iterations. He must have a similar spreadsheet to you in order to have put this script together, because the script layout is meticulous.
Mm-hmm.
For you to be able to go back and do that in itself is a really impressive skill, that he's obviously gone, okay, well, this happens here, and that's that version doing this, and boom, boom, boom. And yet there are still things that he is willing to sort of throw in, like the guy with the beard saying, not sure about that bit, but I'm throwing it in because it shows that there is parts of this that we're not sure about. So it almost raises that question of what is it we... they say you don't know what you don't know. So what is this other stuff that we don't know? What else has changed?
Right.
And that sort of, that to me is where I find it really interesting. But Yeah, that's really impressive that you've got. I'm 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 always curious. Like, is that going across the top? Are we getting into double letters? You know, is that getting into the AA, AB, AC
No,
sort of?
I've done it vertically because
Mm,
um so time is on the vertical axis. So I've got,
hmm
all of the notes, like, Monday around noon, then fourth around 4:30, everything we know, from time. And then on the horizontal axis, I've got iteration 1, iteration 1.1, which is entirely reconstructed but has some flashback material from Abe, um, from the flashback of, yeah, this is how I got it to work, and I saw the ear pier that talked to
Yeah.
you on the bench with no ear piers. So there are some flashbacks there. Iteration 1.2, iteration 2 is begins basically most of the film, and then it's 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, and then iteration 3 is when they use the failsafe to go back uh, to the beginning. But even that begins Monday around 12. Abe 2.5 with 4 days beard emerges from the failsafe. He somehow shaves. Like, I mean, there are things
Mm,
like that where I'm like, wait a minute, how did he shave? Um,
mm,
and then the next yellow box is Abe 2.5 goes to his house where he uses nitrous that he brought with him to gas his former self. Abe 1.0, so now that is the having erased back to the beginning in his sleep, right? So yeah, there's a lot you don't see, and so it's not all that many iterations, but there are multiple ones in between them. Like most of the Granger stuff, I've got a
mm.
huge box that's just like, okay, here's what events at this point are unclear, and then it's like, a bunch of speculation. But it's clear that there are additional iterations between these ones that I've described, but this is the minimum that I could do to make it make sense. And this took me like probably 5 times longer than watching the movie. But I'm insane.
But that's what sci-fi does. That's why I can see why people um, will grab onto this film because there is an element of trying to understand it and uh, unlike as you said sort of David Lynch and where it's sort of it's there for the sake of it rather than having or it's there for some sort of you know aesthetic or
Hmm.
surrealistic point that doesn't really provide anything. Like everything in this, like clearly has a logical point. Like there is a logic to follow. So a puzzle to be undone is a really good way of seeing it. Actually,
Hmm. And I think,
mm.
just to wrap up, I mean, I think that if would you agree? I mean, despite our different reactions to this film, that in the history of sci-fi cinema and the history of time travel in cinema, there's no getting around this one.
Oh no, this watching this. I think this is one of those films that um, anyone making a time travel film going forward has got to go back and see this film multiple times. You can't not now. I think this is important to that genre.
Well,
Definitely.
yeah. Well, it's great that we talked about Inception, because that's going to be our next week, right?
It is. Well, the next three sort of fit into this because we've talked about Inception, and obviously the Christopher Nolan thing, and then we are going to be ending off with Looper. So we are coming back to time travel, and I
Hmm.
have a feeling that your reaction to that will be um, different.
Yes, I think our positions will be reversed when it comes to Looper.
Yeah.
But I love when we disagree, and because it also, first of all, we love each other, we respect each other. I can't say that enough, and we don't have enough of a culture in both of our countries of people passionately disagreeing, but saying, I get where you're coming from. You got a good point there. And this also helps me understand myself in terms of what interests me or how my weird brain works.
No, that's it, and I love the same thing. The conversations, like having these conversations, as you say, sometimes sort of straightens things out in my own brain. So after it, I'm like, okay, I'm now comfortable of my position on that film that I have probably gone round and round the house with and spoken to other people about, where they've probably just frowned at me and gone, okay. So yeah, I think that's the good thing about this film. This film, if anything, if nothing else, for me, this film, you know, generates that notion of sort of debate around time travel, and how it's depicted in Hollywood. You know, and I don't care what I'm saying. This film is sort of seems to be a touchstone, and recently we've had Avengers Endgame introduced time travel, and
not very well, I think.
yeah, and even in that, it's sort of like it's so that, I mean, that introduces it in the Doctor Who fashion, isn't it? Of like
Yes.
timey wimey, wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. Don't worry about it; it doesn't matter.
Right, exactly.
In sort of like, you know, again, I find that film incredibly satisfying from a sort of a narrative and a sort of like the investment I've put in it for the last 10 years. But the time travel in that is incredibly frustrating.
Well, that
And
again, you know, I reiterates the, you know, this different approach, and I think everybody is somewhere on this sort of spectrum where, you know, I people tend to like me. I tend to be perceived as charming in person, but I always feel as if it's a little bit of a game. You know, I always feel like a little bit disconnected, even when everybody's smiling at me and laughing, and I'm laughing. I feel like there's an element of this that's kind of call and response, right? You know, uh, I mean, I always feel a little sort of socially odd and bizarre, and I'm going to go home and make like a spreadsheet about time, you know, time travel and primer or something. You know, I'm a weird duck, and you know, and I think that, you know, on another end of the spectrum, I mean, there are people who look. I mean, I love Doctor Who. I've seen, you know, 75% of even the old stuff. But and I love Star Trek. I've seen almost all of it. But you know, and you can really follow that character. And you know, look, I mean, you know, come on. I mean, I love Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future, right? You know, he's charming and wonderful, and time travel there is, you know, pretty good for its version, but it's not trying to be super smart. I mean, you know, come on, how do people start fading out of existence, right? I mean, this is
yeah.
this is really stupid, but it just works, and it's great, and it's fun, and I think that there's room for multiple kinds of movies, and I think that we'd be better off in a culture in which it's okay to say, like, yeah, that time travel stuff in Endgame doesn't work. On the other hand, I love these characters and I followed them for 10 years in cinema. And it's amazing to see their narrative arcs kind of wrapped up in an emotionally resonant manner. But I can also say that and admit, like, yeah, the movie has problems.
Yeah.
And we can all say that about our sacred cows, and, you know, still enjoy them and get along.
And I think that sort of is definitely lacking, and I think that needs to be important. The ability to sort of is again, there's the whole Star Wars thing as well. Of you know, it's either you either hate it or you love it. It's sort of like, you know, you're either in or you're out, and it sort of seems really bizarre that, you know, there's no middle ground allowed really at the moment. And I find it in a lot of fandoms and a lot of sort of genre sort of things. Happens a lot of places. But like you say, these conversations, and I hope the listeners as well listen to this, I've got no problem if anyone disagrees with me, because as I've sort of said, you know, we've both acknowledged in this that, you know, neither of us has a physics or engineering degree. So I'm happy to admit that I'm clearly not, you know, in some cases bright enough to catch this film at its first pass. Fine. And I'm going to say that, you know, it left me a little cold. That's not a problem. You know,
Right.
For you, it drove you to create a spreadsheet and to dig into it and unsolve the puzzle and to sort of pick it to pieces and try and then put it back together and stuff. And to me, I'm like, oh man, that's amazing. That, you know, that's what this film has driven, that passion, and that's what film's supposed to do. for you, it's driven a passion. Like, I. I watch Ghostbusters on a regular basis, and I get very passionate about that film. Like, I will pick it to pieces, and then sort of like, I acknowledge that film's got. I love that film so much, but I acknowledge it's got a number of flaws. But like I say, I will take that film to part, and like, from a narrative point of view, and I'll think about these things, and sort of like, then you mention to somebody else, and they're like, "Yeah, that's more detail than I've ever thought about for Ghostbusters."
I mean, I think there's room for not only different views, but also for different kinds of joy. I mean, and I think that we have not really cataloged or understood all the different kinds of joy. I mean, there's a kind of like joy of loving the character and, seeing them, sometimes even suffer, but certainly being happy for them when they're doing well. There's a kind of joy that's like, oh, the joy of narrative that, oh, there's a twist that's surprising, right? And then there's a kind of like a little quieter, kind of more abstract joy of like, oh, they're doing very clever things here. I think they're on top of it. I'd like to understand what's going on in this gesture or unpack it. And all of those kinds of joy are wonderful and okay, and I'm a fan of all of them. And even if I can't get to that place, I often talk to people who, go to see a Star Wars movie, and I'm in the middle ground, as you described, and they come back and they say, oh, it was so badass, and I think I've never, just loved something and said, I love it because it's badass, like that's totally foreign to me, but I love the joy on your face, man, that's beautiful and wonderful.
And that's what this has been about, and I think, that's why. And I think more than anything for these conversations, like, going back and watching all these sci-fi films, and also the thing is, like, listeners, you may already guess that we're sort of we're quite into this, so we have already plotted out sort of season 2 with some of the film, for the films we've got coming up, and just to see some of the conversations that are coming up. Like, I'm really excited. Like, the joy I'm getting from that is driving that joy. There's films on there never seen before, and there's films on there that I didn't think I would ever talk about or I'd ever get to talk about. So and that's what I'm hoping this, that's the point of this podcast. Each film we're coming at in a different way. Like this one, we've been quite sort of talking about different forms of like narrative, and we've talked about sort of time travel. Last episode, we were talking about fascist governments and militaristic, jingoistic sort of ideals. It's there's so much to sort of embrace and talk about these films, and that's why I think this is important. And I hope our listeners are enjoying it. So
I hope so too. And I feel the same way. I mean, there are films that we both love that we're just like, it's so much fun that we're going to be able to talk about these movies that mean something to both of us. And then, you got me watching some obscure Brit films that, there's no way in a million years that I would ever encounter. And I can't wait to hear, like why you chose that, why you love that. And that's part of not just discovering different films, but also, we learn about each other and about ourselves through what we like and what we don't like.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm hoping, like, for you listeners out there, sort of, that have come back and challenge us and let us know what you think of these films, especially a film like this that really does challenge you, and sort of, go find it. I found it on Amazon Prime. I have a feeling it's on a couple of other streaming services. It's available on DVD, not on Blu-ray, I don't think, or I couldn't find it, see it anywhere. But do go check this out. It's if you do like those time travel films, do go check this film out. It is incredibly worth your time, but be prepared to work with it. I think that's the best I can say. Like, be prepared to work with it. This isn't a film where you can kick back in a sort of a lazy chair with some popcorn and stuff. No. Like, be prepared to watch it a couple of times. I think that's. But Julian, any final thoughts before we sort of jump out of this?
Just that in the true spirit of encouraging people to participate, especially with the Twitter, at Pod Time Space,
Mm-hmm.
that feel free to tweet at Pod Time Space, Julian, you ignorant slut. This is a terrible movie. That is fine, man. What are your final thoughts? Did I force you to watch something here that?
It's one of those films that I've known about for quite a while, and I keep going, oh, I need to watch that. I need to watch that. So I appreciate that we've got round to watching it. And I do think I'm gonna go back. I've got to go back and watch this to appreciate it, because there are moments in this film I did enjoy, like the final reveal at the end when they do get to the party and stuff. I was like, oh, that bit I really enjoyed. I think I can get more enjoyment from this film if I give it more. I think, and if I meet it on its own terms, I think that's sort of where I've got to be.
Sounds like a relationship.
Well, I think that sort of feels how it sort of felt. I was like, okay, I'm coming into this, and I know it's time travel, and sort of it's about two people, but it's not Bill and Ted. It's it's not Doc and Marty. So I think I'll go back and I'll view it on its own terms rather than expecting it to come to me on my terms, and I think I'll get more out of it for that. But yeah,
well, so I can't wait till the Rick and Morty primer episode.
Yeah, yeah. If that show was to apply any kind of logic, I think it'd be interesting. But yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to us discuss Primer. As I say, it's out there. Go check it out. Let us know what you think. And let us know what you think of our past episodes. We've obviously talked about all kinds of things. Everything from Forbidden Planet to Starship Troopers to The Fly, Blade Runner. So we've had a whole host of things we've discussed. And please get in contact and let us know what you think. But Julian, until next time, thanks very much. And any final thought for the listeners?
I just hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts as much as the two of us enjoy making them. Yeah.
Hopefully, and more people will do too, and listening.
Spread the word.
That's it. Yeah, word of mouth. That's what helps. Get people listening. Reviews. We haven't really talked about these things. So yeah, we're on obviously Spotify and iTunes. And so if you let us know, drop us a review on there, and it gets us up in the whole rankings. Apparently, helps a bit more people find us. But until next time, thank you very much, guys, and we'll speak again soon.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.